And the other thing, what is the other book that I'm reading? What do I want to talk about? I'm not going to talk about Cultish Out, Chris, sorry. I've only read like 2 chapters, so, we'll save that for another time. Is that okay? All right, he's fine.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. You're good.
I'm enjoying it, though. It's convoluted. Anyway, don't keep that in, Jen. I'm really hungry. The other book
Was
that
your tummy?
Yeah, hungry.
I might leave that in, though.
No, do not leave that in.
That's the intro.
No, you guys. The things that I do, I'm literally poor and starving here for this podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who love books. My name is Chris, and I'm coming to you from the United States. Jenny is coming to you from England, and Sarah is coming to you from the Netherlands. And today we have a book club episode for you, where we are going to be discussing Louise Erdrich's 2021 Women's Prize shortlisted novel, The Sentence. But before we do that, shall we talk a little bit about some of our recent and current reads?
Let's do that. I've only got one book to talk about, so Chris,
Okay.
you go first.
I'll start us off. I just recently read a book which I won't spend too much time talking about because it's already been mentioned on the podcast before, which is the nonfiction book Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. I really like this book. I listened to most of it on audiobook, and it's a really interesting look at the way that cults and kind of manipulative groups use language to coerce their members into doing things that they otherwise wouldn't do, giving up time, resources, isolating from their loved ones, etc. And she looks at really extreme cases like Jonestown, which is one of the most extreme cases of cult mind control in the history of the world. And then she actually starts to kind of broaden her focus from the really extreme cases and the kind of easily recognizable cults into things that aren't necessarily cults, but use that same type of manipulative language in order to get their members to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. She looks at fitness groups like CrossFit. She looks at multi-level marketing strategies, which oftentimes use a lot of this kind of woo-woo language, for lack of a better word, to make their members feel special and different from the rest of the world in order to get them to sell products, essentially. And then she also looks at like examples where the use of this language would actually be positive, because sometimes, as long as the group isn't destructive, this kind of language that would maybe get you to do something you otherwise wouldn't do, such as like maybe vigorously exercise. Like she looks at the Soul Cycle movement, which has like the potential for abuse, but actually for most people, they lose themselves to this woo-woo language for 45 minutes and do some cycling, and it's just good for their health, and it's not that big of a deal, and it's not destroying their life, and they're not spending exorbitant amount of money on it. And so this is like kind of an example of how that language can be empowering. But in mostly the book is kind of a warning for people. So it was a really interesting read for me. I spent 21 years inside of a cult, and I was a recruiter and all that stuff. So it was really interesting for me to read it and kind of reflect back on some of the language that I would use when I was in the group, and the ways that I would definitely manipulate people without thinking that I was manipulating people, because I've been told, this is how we present the message, this is how we tell people what we're about, and also the kind of weird, bizarre language that I would use with other members of the group, but wouldn't use with outsiders, a lot of these like kind of thought terminating cliches and stuff like that. So it was a really interesting book, like having that experience to read and reflect on and kind of see some of these tactics reflected back at you. So it was a really interesting read for me, and I really liked it. I'm glad that Jenny brought it up on that episode and I got the courage to read it.
How many stars have you given it, Chris?
I would give it a solid 4.
Yeah.
It was a really informative read. I think that if you haven't really approached the subject before, it's one that's really going to get you thinking. I will say I think that she's treading a lot of ground that has been covered by some other sociologists, like Stephen Hassan in his book Combating Cult Mind Control. So she's definitely resting on the backs of a lot of other academics, but she's presenting it in a way that's way more accessible than they are.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed the parts where she was talking about Soul Cycle and Peloton and the likes, and how they use the same sort of in language for more positive reasons.
Yes.
But like you said, I think if you have read around cults and cultish behaviour before, you're not going to get as much out of it.
No.
But in terms of, an introduction,
but I
think it's very good.
I did like the fact that there were things that like I knew and recognized from my own experience that she was able to kind of like assign kind of like an academic label to, like the whole thought terminating cliche. This was like definitely, we had tons of these in my group, like so many I can't even begin to name them. And I always called them when I was leaving the group, and I would try and talk to people about like some of the stuff we think is kind of crazy. They would always hit me back with things that just didn't make any sense, and kind of just stop the conversation. So I used to call them conversation stoppers, but thought terminating cliche is actually a much more specific term for what they are. So yeah, I really liked that aspect of the book.
She's what's the word? Linguist?
Yeah, she is a linguist, and she's clearly very smart.
I think I haven't finished reading this book yet, but I'm reading it as well, kind of slowly. I actually, as a note, didn't like the audiobook at all, so I started the audiobook and then ended up returning it, and I'm waiting for the physical book to come through from the library, so maybe just sample it if you want to read it and see if you like the narrator or not. I really liked the bits where she's talking about, she really isolates the sort of us versus them mechanisms and how this is used. And even though I didn't grow up in a cult, but I did grow up in a very religious sort of place, and a lot of the sort of, there's all these ways that they sort of control the narrative and control the way that you are thinking about things, especially like troublesome things that happen to you. There's a lot of like narrative control about that, which I even recognized in my own upbringing, which was not, I mean, I guess it's a blurry line at some point, right? But like nothing compared to what you went through, Chris. But yeah, I found it really interesting. I definitely recognized a lot of behavior.
Yeah, it was really funny because one of the things that kind of cracked me up a little bit was the us versus them mentality, because I started thinking a little bit about stuff we used to say. So the term we had for everybody who was an outsider was worldly. And for years, I had no idea that the term worldly meant somebody who was world-wise and sophisticated. I always thought it just meant evil. Like for years, until I was like a solid 21 years of age, I had no idea what that word actually meant. Which is funny because it goes into the way they kind of like take a word that has a recognizable meaning on the outside and they completely transform it until you have a different idea of what it actually means. But same thing, we would like kind of preempt narratives. So something we would do is that when you were introducing somebody to the group, you would tell them, Satan doesn't want you to join this group. Okay? Like Satan doesn't want you to. So the second you start telling outsiders that you're thinking about joining, they're going to try, like your family is going to try and convince you not to do it, not to join all this different stuff, but that's Satan talking to you. And like that's what we would tell people. So you totally like preempt and grab the narrative before they can like really logically think it out for themselves. And as long as they're kind of like an open-minded person, they're probably a little bit susceptible to believing some of this stuff. So yeah, we would definitely do a lot of that.
Interesting. I always found it so funny how much there was so much like God and Satan centric, as if they would really pitch it as though God and Satan were really looking at you, an individual person, and they really cared like what you were doing. I always found that crazy. Like Satan's so disappointed that this is happening today, as if he cares. She says, you know what I mean. But I always found that hilarious. It's so egocentric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting book, and I really enjoyed reading it. And I think it's definitely a good primer for the topic if you're interested in reading it. And then the other book I've got going on is I'm just rereading A Clash of Kings, the second book in A Song of Ice and Fire. Been kind of in a reading slump and wanting to just kind of go back to things that are familiar. And so I decided to pick that one up again. And within 10 chapters, which the chapters in those books are really short, so just within 10 chapters already, I'm just blown away again. Like, I know that those books are some of the most famous books in all of fantasy and all, but like, they are for a reason. Like, they're really good. And I always forget like how strong of a writer George is, especially of character. until I reread his books. I'm like, oh yeah, like this guy's great. Like the way he just instantly characterizes people by the way they walk into a room and stuff. Very atmospheric, really engaging, and yeah, I'm just very excited about rereading that one, and kind of a cozy read, even though it's a bit bleak.
Even I've read half of that one. That's as far as I got, like halfway through the second book.
Oh, you missed all the good
One
bits.
day I'll pick them up, but I don't know.
Yeah, I've read them all. I didn't like them that much, but I think it was more me.
Boo.
Excuse me.
Just teasing you.
I was definitely reading them for the wrong reasons. I was trying to impress someone. Let's not talk about it.
Never a good idea.
No, never a good idea. Didn't work
We've
anyway.
all been there, though.
Yeah, read them all like a fool. Anyway, so
Are you impressed?
yeah, it's just me trying to feverishly impress
Were they
suitors
impressed?
as my younger self. No, and it was a terrible thing to be doing anyway. And I should not have been interested in that person in the first place. So let's just move on, shall we?
Moving
Maybe I'll
on.
reread them one day.
That's
I don't want to talk about it. Please don't ask me any more questions. Right, what I hear you guys saying is, what are you reading, Sarah?
Yeah, what are you reading, Sarah?
Go on, Sarah.
I am reading 2 books. The first one I'm reading is We the Drowned by Carsten Jensen, which I think is the book that has been on my TBR for the absolute longest, translated from the Danish. And it is about a group of... It's a historical fiction. I, for some reason, thought this novel was fantasy, and I have for years. I don't know what you thought, Chris, because I think I heard about this book from you originally.
I knew it was historical fiction, but I know why you got that vibe, because the cover, if you have the cover I have, is very fantasy looking.
Yeah.
Like, it's a beautiful cover.
Yeah, it is nice. I've got a nice photo for the gram, just so you know, Jen, for the future. Anyway, and it's about a group of sailors, but it takes place over several hundred years. So I think at the moment, I'm something like the 18th century is what's happening, and it's just following this group of schoolboys at the moment, essentially. And there are a lot of wars happening, and they're sort of fighting Germans and a couple of other people that are coming back and forth. But so far, it's mainly just following this little this small group of boys who are actually being mistreated quite badly by their headmaster, and he's beating them and that kind of thing. And it's kind of looking at the way that the violence that they're experiencing is kind of affecting them as adults, and how that they kind of react to things, which is not at all what I thought it would be about, to be honest. But so far I'm really enjoying it. It's kind of got a burial rites kind of feeling. It's quite bleak, and it's very, very atmospheric. I'm really enjoying it, but haven't got super far through yet.
That sounds really good.
I own this one.
I think you guys both own it, don't you?
Yeah, that's not what I thought it was about either.
No, completely different to what I think it's going to move on to more of a kind of war-based thing, but at the
Yeah.
moment we're just following these kids because they end up doing quite a lot of awful things to local dogs and stuff, but they're all going through this awful thing. It's not super explicit. It's not too bad to read, but yeah, it's not at all what I thought it was so far. Right, the next book that I'm reading is called Notes for a Bisexual Revolution by Shiri Eisner, I think. Shiri Eisner, which is a non-fiction book, and it is mostly about bisexuality, but it's also a lot about kind of queer politics and how different subcultures within the queer community kind of interact with each other, fight with each other. She's dealing with a couple of really key issues in the queer community and how these kind of unfold in like different groups of people. And it's really interesting. It's probably the first book I've read that's like fully about bisexuality, but yeah, it's really, really interesting. And if you're interested in bisexuality and sort of detailed queer politics, then I would definitely recommend it. It's probably not a great book to start off with if it's sort of the first book of its kind that you would be reading. It kind of assumes quite a lot of knowledge, but it's quite academic and interesting book, which I recommend.
Is it an essay collection, or is it kind of...
No, it's a very academic. She's a sociologist, I believe, so
Okay.
it's quite an academic takedown. She goes through all kinds of different things, so different types of phobias that can exist. She goes through biphobia in quite a lot of detail, and how that kind of manifests from like straight people, from people who are gay, from like literally whoever. There's a really interesting chapter where she talks about some of the stereotypes that queer people have about each other and themselves, and how often we will sort of debunk these but she kind of rejects that notion that we should be debunking them in the first place, like it's not inherently a bad thing, and how that it can be kind of phobic in a way to be to have these stereotypes like, oh, people who are like this are bad because they do this, and then we end up saying like, oh, no, that's not true, we don't do that at all, but there's nothing wrong with that in the first place, right? So it's a very intellectual book. I'm really enjoying it.
What was that called, Sarah?
It's just called Bi, Notes for a Bisexual Revolution.
Never heard of it. That sounds great.
No, I saw it. I think I saw it. Some of the articles that were coming out around Pride Month. I think there was some really interesting non-fictions.
I am currently reading We Had to Remove This Post by... Now, I didn't realise this was translated from the Dutch, so I don't know, Sarah, if you can help me with this lady's surname.
I'd prefer it if you gave me your best
Hanna
go at it, Jen.
Bervoets?
Bervoets.
Bervoets.
Yeah, Bervoets.
That sounds much nicer than how I said it. It's translated from the Dutch by Emma Rout. And I think this had quite a lot of... Well, I'd heard of it because it seemed to have quite a lot of pre-hype before it was released. And it's about a woman called Kaylee who works for a company called Hexa. They moderate posts on social media and remove anything that's flagged as inappropriate or not, as the case may be. So she works for a company called Hexa, who are working for an unnamed social media company, but I think the general vibe is it's Facebook. It's really short. It's only about 160 pages, so I guess technically that's a novella. I'm reading it on the Kindle, and like every page is 1%, so it's nice to whip through something for a change. I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm about 40% in, and she is recounting her experiences to a lawyer. That's what the narrative is that she's telling this lawyer who is suing on behalf of the Hexa employees. I'm not entirely sure who they're suing. I was probably told at some point. And it's going to look at, I think, the mental health effects on the employees of this company. I'm like 40% through, and interestingly, I've just reached a section where they're all in the local pub together, and the language that they use when they talk to each other is quite derogatory and particularly homophobic, even though there's gay people within their own friendship group. So it's definitely going to go down the lines of blurring the boundaries and what happens when you interact with that kind of content and how it might desensitize you. But so far I'm enjoying it a lot.
I've not even heard of it before, but I just looked it up and it has a really cool cover. So I
Yes, it has too. I think the American edition is particularly cool. The UK edition's the like purple version.
Okay. The US edition looks like rainbow static. It's really cool
it's
looking.
really good.
So are the things that they kind of have to moderate on these posts, does it tend to be kind of like hate speech or like nudity? Like what's kind of their
So it's
angle?
all of it. She does explain some of the stuff that they have to see, but she doesn't go into huge detail. Like she talks about the tests that they have to do the job in the first place, and it's almost more interesting what they're allowed to keep online as opposed to what they remove, because what they remove is, I don't know, I think it'd be pretty obvious to everybody what they need to remove. But in terms of what they're allowed to leave online is really interesting. So it's a little bit graphic, so what I'm about to say you might want to skip for 20 seconds, but they talk about this video where this man is playing with dead cats essentially.
Oh my God.
But that is not a post that needs to be removed unless there's violence involved, there's anything in the caption that suggests that those cats were killed by someone. So it's really interesting, and I think the author did a lot of research into what companies like Facebook, the rules that they set and what they allow and what they don't. And you can imagine the number of these, well, they have targets, so, and I can't remember what the target is that they have to get through, but they must have way more posts that are flagged to them that they can ever get through, which is why when stuff happens by accident, made me really think, posts get banned for like female nudity, and actually there isn't nudity because it's all been quite tastefully done, but those posts will be banned and then there's big uproar and those posts aren't reinstated for 2 weeks. But you kind of think, in the grand scheme of what they must see and what must come through and what they have to prioritise, you can see why stuff like that happens and that it's never necessarily dealt with. So yeah, I'm finding it really interesting. It's really thought-provoking for such a tiny little book.
Sorry, just a note, I realise I mistranslated the title. The original title is What We Saw, not What We See. That makes more sense. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
I prefer that title. This is where we take a little break to tell you all about the different ways you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. And if you listen on Spotify, you can now very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We're at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter where we share even more book recommendations and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, we do have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you all the above and personalised book recommendations. We get you to fill in a survey and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. There are over 15 bonus episodes you can get instant access to if you sign up as a patron today. The link is in our show note. But however you choose to show your support, we as always want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners.
All right, shall we talk about The Sentence? The Sentence by Louise Erdrich follows a woman named Tookie, an unintentional felon turned bookseller working in a specialty independent bookshop in Minneapolis. In November 2019, just months until chaos is to erupt on the world scene, Tookie's most annoying customer, a white woman obsessed with native culture, named Flora, dies, and her spectral presence begins haunting the bookstore. As Tookie tries to understand why Flora refuses to remain dead, the bookstore, its employees and patrons, must shift to a new reality in Minneapolis as the COVID pandemic rages and the murder of George Floyd ruptures the peace of their city. I loved this book. How did you guys feel about it?
I'm really glad you loved it.
Okay.
I didn't dislike it, and I don't think I consumed it in the right format because I listened to it, and I don't think the audiobook was great. I wish I'd read it. I had it out of the library because I had to do a long drive. I was like, I'll get this done in the car, and it wasn't the right way to do it. It's narrated by the author, which I found really interesting. You don't often see that. I listened to another audiobook recently, and he actually talked about the fact that he had to audition for his own reading of his book. So I don't know. Poor Louise, but I didn't love the narration of it, which didn't help.
The only criticism I would levy against this book, well, there are a few. I don't think it's a perfect book, but one of the things that did kind of get under my skin in this book is that it's set in a bookstore and there are lots of conversations about contemporary books, right? And lots of book titles and authors getting thrown around. And I didn't love that. The reason why is I felt like it was trying to... One, it was making the act of reading seem so sentimental. Like, books are essential. And it felt like it was trying to make the reader feel special for being the kind of person who likes contemporary literature. And then because there's so many different titles and authors being thrown around, it's like allowing readers who do keep up with all this like kind of contemporary literature to feel like they're in on this conversation. You know what I'm trying to say? And I just didn't like that aspect of the book, and it felt really unnecessary. Even though there were times when a book would get mentioned, I was like, oh, I love that book. And, you know, that I got that kind of connection. Like, I get it, you know, but that's because I'm the type of person that this book was targeted for. Whereas I don't think that's good for a general audience. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I was going to say, I wonder how alienating that was for someone who isn't I mean, I'd heard of a lot of the books you mentioned because we do this podcast. Otherwise, yeah, I don't think I'd have recognised a lot of them.
Yeah, I thought that was quite an odd inclusion. I could see that some people would really, I was about to say something super crass, get excited about seeing books that they like or don't like mentioned. I was the same. I really didn't like that aspect of it. I thought it was too, I don't know, I didn't like it. Also, I found myself weirdly judging her book recommendations, and especially she recommended a lot of authors that I don't like, and I was like, Richard Flanagan, really? So, yeah, I didn't like that. It was a bit too sucking up to readers or something.
Yes, I agree. That's exactly what it is. It feels like it's trying to ingratiate itself to readers. And also, I'm not the type of person that, like, I love reading. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, don't get me wrong. I love reading. I obviously love talking about books. Like, I wouldn't have spent the past 6 years of my life doing what I do if that wasn't the case.
Imagine. This is a good opportunity for me, actually, guys, to make an announcement. I hate books.
I hate books. But I don't love the attitude that reading imbues some sort of moral superiority or intellect or is some sort of radical act of something. Like, it's not. Like, at the end of the day, it's entertainment, it's media. Plenty of people who don't like books get the same thing out of other avenues of media and entertainment. And, like, I don't know. There's something about the kind of, like, reading is special mentality gets under my skin a little bit.
Yeah, me too. I also reject that notion that, like, reading is learned, intellectualism is reading. You know, you can be an interesting and worldly person without reading books, that's for sure. This book didn't do that much for me, actually, so I'm really glad you liked it, Chris. Do you mind if I expose you? Tell you what you did?
Yeah, absolutely, because I will fully admit it. I'll fully admit this.
I got a voice message from Chris about 2 days ago that was quite long, if you don't mind me saying. He was like, I absolutely hate this book. And then he started to detail to me exactly why he hated this book. And then he messaged me yesterday. He was like, I love the book.
The opening chapter killed me. I did hate that opening chapter. So the book opens up on the act that got Tookie imprisoned, which the actual, like, Tookie's actual imprisonment really bears very little on the actual where the story goes. Like, to be honest, like, I got how it influenced her character, but I also felt like there was a part of me that felt like it could have been completely removed from the book and the book would almost be the exact same. But it opens up with how she got imprisoned. And there was something about the kind of slapstick crime element of that opening section that just got under my skin. I did not like it. I didn't like the absurdity of it. I didn't like the tone of it. Like, that really grated on me. And that's when I sent her the message, like, I hate this book. Like, I hate this opening chapter so much. But by like 40, 50 pages in, I was like, oh, I was totally wrong. This is a really good book.
That opening chapter is what made me realise it wasn't the book that I thought it was, actually. Because all I'd really read about it was, like, short blurbs, probably from the Women's Prize website, that said it was a ghost story set in a bookshop, which it is, but actually it's way, way more than that, and about way, way more than that. I found it really strange that was the hook that they went with it, but then again, that is what drew my attention. But it's way deeper than that. They gave it such a shallow intro.
What I found really interesting about this is that Louise Erdrich owns the bookshop in real life, that's described in the book, which you're kind of clued in on as the reader because you learn that the owner of the shop is a woman named Louise, who ends up being a very minor character. Like, Louise Erdrich is not doing a self-insert. Exactly. She kind of cameos herself in the book because she actually owns this bookshop in Minneapolis called Birch Bark Books. And it's a bookshop that obviously has all sorts of books in it, but with a heavy influence and specialty on Native literature because Louise herself is a Native woman. And I found that really interesting. Like, as I was reading the book, I kept, like, going to pictures of the real bookshop. And one of the kind of deals going on in this bookshop is that they have a confessional that they salvaged. And the real bookshop has a confessional as well that they salvage. And I found all of this like kind of quirky stuff like really interesting. And like the book made me realize something. The book made me realize that I was put on this earth to work in a quirky independent bookshop. And every day that I don't is an affront to my God-given destiny. And I am just angry. Because like every time she would like talk about like all the like customers and stuff like that, I was like, it should have been me living this life.
Chris has found himself. That's
Yeah.
great news. That's wonderful. That's wonderful news. What high praise for a book. I found my true self in this book. I really wasn't into that bookshop aspect of it, so that's very interesting. I guess you're much more of a book shopper than me, that's for sure.
All right, yeah, I love going into bookshops.
Yeah, I didn't find it entertaining. Like maybe I used to work in retail, so maybe I'm just scarred from like all of these customers. But yeah, I didn't particularly. It was okay, but yeah, I thought that was not. It didn't do much for me. For me, this book, there were a lot of elements in it. There's kind of like, it's hard to sort of describe succinctly, right? Because there's so many elements of this main character. So there's the ghost aspect of it. There's all of the stuff that's going on about like native rights and that kind of thing. There's kind of ongoing conversations there. This is set in real time in the first half of 2020, which is kind of wild. And it's set like true to life first half of 2020. So there's like the COVID pandemic breaks out. There's all of the discussion about how they're going to cope with that. Then the George Floyd things happen, of course, because it's quite close to where that actually happened, right, Chris?
Oh, it's the same city. Yeah.
Same city,
It's
okay, yeah.
the
Oh,
same
yeah,
city.
Minneapolis, of course.
Yeah.
So there's all of that is super detailed. Then a lot of the main characters start to go to the protests and all the way that that's kind of like dealt with the police is in there. Then a couple of people get really sick with COVID. There's all that kind of like underlying uncertainty. And then there's her whole back history with her husband and how that all worked. And there's that weird history with her daughter and how that all kind of works. Like, there's just so many. And there's like her daughter's relationship with a couple of different people in the book. We won't be too specific because it's a bit spoilery, but yeah, there's so many like aspects of this. I found it a bit, I think I found it a bit much all in all. I really needed, I think, some parts of it taken out because I just felt like I couldn't get too into any single aspect of the story because I was just trying to like keep it all in my mind and try and... I felt like maybe this book changed quite a lot as it was being written because I don't know when she was writing
That's
this, but it must have been like the latter half of 2020, right?
She was writing it like contemporaneously. So I watched an interview with her and she said that basically she had always wanted to write a ghost story in a bookstore. And she never really knew like how to, say something with that, but she was always intrigued by that idea. And then when when COVID happened and we're all being isolated and we're all kind of, I think something about COVID is that we all kind of realized that like what we expected for the future of the rest of our lives was going to be significantly different. You know what I mean? There was always going to be this new fear, this new kind of paranoia. And so she kind of found that to be like the end to go with this story, because, and it is true, there was a huge movement after the COVID pandemic started to start ordering books from your local independent bookstores to keep them in business. And so while this pandemic is raging, the actual employees of the bookstore keep showing up to work, working alone in this bookstore with no other employees present, packaging books and setting them outside for curbside pickup. And it is this complete aloneness inside the bookstore where this annoying customer, Flora, really takes advantage and starts to haunt. What I found interesting is that the haunting itself was quite absurd feeling. It wasn't a scary haunting. Like, the most this woman ever does is, like, trip her, push her. You never get the sense that, like, she's in real danger.
Yeah, it's not spooky. It's kind of low-level irritation.
Exactly.
I kind of kept forgetting that was happening, and then she'd sort of go back to the bookstore, and I'm like, oh, that's right, there's this damn ghost storyline. I forgot about the ghost. So, I don't know. I didn't feel that the ghost element of it works very well with the rest of the narrative, I think. I feel like it was a bit ham-fisted or something.
I felt the opposite. I loved the ghost element of it. I guess the reason I liked it is, one, I like funny ghosty stuff in general. Like, I find that kind of thing a little bit interesting. And especially because, like, my family has so many, like, ridiculous haunting stories that I don't know whether or not to think they really happened, but, they get told all the time. And so, for example, weird story. One of the big legends of my family is that the French horn that my sister got for band was haunted and would play on its own. And they would say that it was like really loud playing. Like there was no mistaking it for like wind or something like that. Like it was definitely the French horn playing, and they had to return it because it had a ghost. And so like the idea of like a ghost that haunts but is just annoying you, I find actually kind of funny and like interesting.
Relatable.
Yeah. And this woman in real life was annoying. She was a white woman who was obsessed with Native culture. She felt like she probably was Native, and she was always looking for this evidence that she was, and never really finding it. And what she finds is this manuscript book, which is these diary entries of a young Native woman who was captured and forced to be white. And it's probably something she read in this book that actually killed her, which is kind of the mystery you're unraveling as you read the book, is trying to figure out what was in this book that ultimately murdered this woman, and does this book have some sort of like supernatural power to it? What information was in this book? Which goes back to kind of the overly sentimental view this book has on reading and the power of reading, but I digress. What I found interesting, I guess, is that this woman was annoying in real life for this very particular reason, continues to haunt and stalk this Native bookstore. Like this kind of constant, like, white annoyance in these people's lives continues on even after her death, in similar ways that like colonialism and more traumatic elements of whiteness continue on in indigenous lives long after the events have actually happened. So I found that kind of element interesting because obviously this woman's haunting is much smaller, less traumatic, but so grating on these people's lives.
Yeah, I quite like the ghost side of it, actually. But I did find that I thought the book really lacked focus. And because I was listening, I was like, which character are we with? Oh, it didn't help with the narration, but I was like, which character are we with now? I don't even know what's happening anymore, which is... Listeners will laugh. Neither me nor Sarah wanted to introduce this book, and I made Chris do it because I was like, I don't think I'd know what to say or to say what this book was actually about. So yeah, I don't know. I just felt like it had too much packed into it. Therefore, it was all done just a little bit thinly, which is a gripe that I have with books anyway when that happens.
I listened to a portion of the audiobook, and you are totally right. I knew without even looking at who narrated it, because I didn't look at who narrated it. I just downloaded it and was listening to a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I knew instantly that it had to be Louise Erdrich because she was not doing the voices for the characters. No. She was not differentiating the characters at all. I was like, oh, this is not a professional audiobook narrator.
It changed narrator, right? Is it narrated from a different character at one point?
There are portions, very small snippets of the
portions. Book. Yeah, I was like, who's narrating now? I'm completely thrown out of this because I have no idea what's going on.
The overwhelming majority of the book is narrated from Tookie's perspective, but there's like a couple...
daughter?
Yeah, a couple small chapters that are told from Hedda's perspective, who's Tookie's stepdaughter. And I think one tiny little snippet that's told from Tookie's husband's perspective, whose name is Pollux. But yeah, she was not capturing voice changes at all, which was one of the reasons I quickly quit listening to the audiobook. Something I found a little bit odd about the book is that in most of the publicity I had seen about the book, they really centered on the George Floyd protests and acted like this book was really going to confront the way Minneapolis, obviously experienced a pretty extreme paradigm shift that year. And in a sense it does. Like, there is a focus on it, but it's really like 50 to 60 pages in the middle that's the real kind of main focus. Like, that is not the whole of the book. Like, it is a part of the 2020 experience, but it is just one part of this 2020 experience. It is not the whole thing.
Tookie herself doesn't really engage with it that much. She's a bit more preoccupied by other things. So I think for that reason, the other characters mostly are going to the protest or involved, and she's kind of a bit, there's other things that are happening that she's thinking more about. So it's not sort of super directly dealing with it. at any point, I wouldn't say.
No. Something I found was a really interesting choice was that the book, once the George Floyd protests happen, the little chapter snippets start to be labeled by date. And what happens is that she calls it May 30th, then May 31st, then May 32nd, May 33rd, May 34th, which I thought was really interesting because it made me reflect on the fact that that month when that was happening, I did feel like May was never ending. Like it felt like this continuous stream in that time. So I thought that was a really interesting tactic to kind of play with the way, or show how the way the pandemic and all these massive events shifting was playing with our perspective on time. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. And it's a very small detail. Like she didn't like harp on it or anything. It was just those little tiny chapter titles, and I thought that was quite interesting.
I did not know that was in there. So now that. Don't listen to the audio.
Yeah, don't listen to the audiobook, it sounds like.
No, I did not know that happened. That's quite a clever detail to put in.
Yeah, it's very clever. What did you guys think of Tookie herself as a character?
I thought she was extremely flawed.
Flawed as in the way she was written, or as a person?
As a person.
Okay. I thought as a character she wasn't very good. I actually didn't think any of the characters were like particularly good, which was my other sort of... So, yeah, my main issues with this book were I thought there were too many elements to it, and I didn't like the characters. And Tookie herself, I didn't like her very much, actually, as a person. But
no, I didn't like her as a person. I don't know if you're really supposed to really like her as a person. She's kind of self-centered at times. She's prickly. She seems to just be in her own world at times, you know?
Yeah, she's quite judgmental as well. I remember, especially at the beginning when she's introducing to the reader a couple of her colleagues, she's very judgmental about them. And she's not very giving, I would say, as a person.
No. And there's times when she learns about, like, there's a coworker she has named Penn. I can't remember the full name, but they shortened it to Penn.
Pensterman, wasn't she?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure it was Penn that would kind of have the very active romantic life. Or was it Asima? I can't remember now. It's burning in my brain. It was Penn, right? And there were times when I felt like she was quite judgmental about Penn, or she would make these kind of sarcastic comments that I was like, I would have to be in quite a close relationship for someone to make a comment like that to me and not promptly beat their ass. Like, like, you know what I mean? Like, so there's times when I'm just like, but it gets brushed off aside. Like, the characters kind of have this cold way of talking to each other at times. And the other thing that I found a little bit odd in this book was sometimes when there would be a dialogue exchange, it was a little bit hard to follow, like, where ideas were coming in. Like, people would shift their ideas really quickly in topics in the conversation. And I don't know if you guys experienced that as well, but there would be times when a reply would be made, and I'd be like, whoa, what caused this person to start thinking this way? You know what I'm trying to say? Yeah,
I know exactly what you're talking about. And my interpretation of that is that the writing wasn't very good. This is kind of what I was getting at when I said that the characters were a bit flat. In my reading of it, I found that the writing was quite tell, don't show. No, show, don't tell. The bad one. Show, don't tell. No, tell, don't show.
Tell, don't show.
Tell, don't show.
Bad one.
Thank you. So she would sort of describe the characteristics of each person in terms of like what they were wearing and what kind of a person they were, but you wouldn't get any real demonstration of that until they was until it was kind of required for their conversation. And I didn't feel that it would always necessarily line up with what we'd just been told. And I was thinking, I wasn't sure if that was like Tookie was supposed to have this inaccurate perception of people, or if it was just like bad writing. I fell on the side of thinking the writing wasn't very good, but maybe you disagree.
I don't think the fact that I didn't really feel like Tookie had any kind of growth arc at all. Like, she's just who she is, and that's who she is the whole way through. This is probably, well, it is a spoiler, so don't listen to the next kind of 30 seconds if you don't want to hear an actual spoiler. But I mean, her husband gets COVID at one point and he's incredibly unwell with it. But like, her story arc with that was just like flat all the way through. It's just like, I don't understand how that wouldn't have a profound effect on you. Like, she just goes to work and has normal conversations. It was just, I found it all quite strange.
Well, she didn't go to work for a while. She was like, she traveled to St. Paul to like stay in the parking garage.
Yeah, she hangs out at the hospital. She's quite
But when she goes back to work, like, it just wasn't really
Yeah, that is true.
reflected on.
Mm-hmm.
Even with her colleagues, you'd think actually this is a really big deal for someone to go through. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't really feel like she explored any of the ideas in the book brilliantly well. Probably because there were too many in there for her to do that.
I would agree that I think the book had one too many elements. The one element, if I were to get rid of any element in the book, the element I would have gotten rid of was Hedda's storyline. I would have gotten rid of Hedda, the baby, and Laurent, or whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's not... I did find you... So basically what happens is that the stepdaughter Hedda returns to their life with a baby, and she's not told them that she's pregnant. The baby is named Jarvis. He's a cute little thing. Steals the show a little bit. You soon realize that the father of this baby is a man named Laurent, who sometimes frequents the bookshop and claims to have discovered a dead language that he's written all these books in. And he's just kind of an odd character. You're not really sure like what to make of the guy. Is he a bad guy? He doesn't seem to really be taking any responsibility for this kid that's obviously his. And then towards the end of the book, you do get a final reveal as to like what the hell is going on with these people and stuff. And it was interesting enough. Like, I liked that reveal, and I liked the kind of absurdity, abstract nature of the reveal. Was I supposed to believe it? Was I not supposed to believe it? You know, that kind of sense of magical realism. But that whole storyline, I feel like, could have still been removed from the book, and it probably would have been a more focused, better book for it.
Can I disagree with you? I would keep that
Really?
and remove the ghost. Definitely. I actually feel that was one of the strongest bits of the book.
Oh,
I would
interesting.
do a whole book about that particular story.
Oh, interesting.
I think if she could have written a whole novel based around
Yeah,
that
that's true.
storyline, I
That's true.
felt she should have written 2 books. We'll read the ghost one, and then I'd have read a whole book about that.
That's so funny. I can't believe you liked the ghost line, Chris. I'm really surprised by that. I thought you were going to be absolutely spewing about the ghost.
I really liked the ghost bit. I thought it was just funny and weird, and you know, I never quite knew where it was going to go. I liked the fact that the ghost was like constantly throwing down like intentional titles and stuff like that. Like I found the whole thing like just this idea of this like petulant, annoying white woman in this native bookstore. Like, just constantly trying to intrude, like, kind of funny.
Shall we summarize, try and get our thoughts kind of together cohesively? So Jen and I thought that there were too many aspects to the book, right? Did you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, but the one aspect of the book that I would have gotten rid of is not the aspect of the book you guys would have gotten rid of, so...
Yeah, exactly. I didn't like the ghost. You guys liked the ghost.
Yeah.
Chris didn't like the extended family saga bit to it. Jenny and I did like it. So interesting. A very mixed book. Probably a good one for a book club, I would say, actually, because it generates a lot of
lots
conversation.
to talk about, I think.
I should clarify. It's not that I disliked the storyline with Hedda. I just felt like added to the book, like to the rest of the story, it just seemed like kind of an odd insert for the rest of it. And like if it had been gotten rid of, the book just would have been more focused. Like it felt like kind of just out of place, I felt like, to the rest of the book.
Yeah, you thought it was the weakest. Funny, I didn't. Yeah, what did you think of the writing, by the way, both of you?
I really liked it.
You liked it. That was one of the things that you explicitly were complaining about to me.
In the beginning, I hated it. In the beginning, I did not like the weird way that the crime was being handled. I was like, are these real judges and lawyers? This seems insane. Like, this seems like this would not actually happen in real life. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, did you feel that way as well?
Yeah, I thought it was a bit... Yeah, there were some aspects of it where it was a bit stilted or something. I'm not sure. It wasn't.
It didn't make sense to me. I was like, no one would act like. Someone would have asked the questions here. You know what I'm trying to say, and like gotten to the bottom of what happened, and like nobody is, and they're all like running with this like weird version of events that doesn't make sense to anybody. Like, I don't know. Like, to me, that just felt so bizarre, and the way it was handled felt so bizarre and just grating. And once we got past that, and we're like, okay, here is Tookie's life now after prison, I was like, okay, I can settle into this. But up to that point, I was just really unsettled by that and did not enjoy it.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of aspects actually that we were maybe as readers supposed to take in on good faith, but
yeah,
that was definitely one of them. Also, her relationship with her husband, that wasn't that well explained, even though there was quite a lot of weird backstory there that I think we never really explained fully. Also the baby sort of storyline as well. Yeah.
I liked the writing style, like the sentence by sentence writing I liked. She reminds me a little bit, just a teensy bit, of Anne Patchett's writing style. I would say Patchett is way better in general, but there's this kind of like compulsive readability, page-turning nature to it, where the sentences feel very precise and there for a really specific reason, and there is a lot to dig your teeth into, and yet it's readable. Like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, you can just kind of really keep turning the page. And I find that the same thing happens with Anne Patchett. Another similarity between Anne Patchett and Louise Erdrich is Anne Patchett also owns an independent bookstore in her hometown, so kind of another little interesting thing. So I quite liked the sentence by sentence writing.
Yeah, I listen to the audio, which just makes it really hard to appreciate writing, I find. Anyway, I try not to listen to that many fiction books on audio for that reason. So yes, I don't know what my thoughts are on the writing.
And the characters, you two both felt like the characters were weaker
The
than I
characters
thought they were.
were flat, yeah. I definitely feel like that's why some of the storylines felt really like plonked in, because actually her character arcs weren't very good, and I feel like the storyline with the grandchild would have been better if Tookie had had more of a story arc, and the things that happened to her made sense and made a bigger impact on who she became. But because I feel like her character was quite flat, they all seemed quite random.
I quite liked the way Tookie was written. Actually, I found her kind of abrasiveness, and she's both abrasive, and then at times you kind of find out that she's oddly sentimental about things, and emotional about things. You know, like she'll say kind of harsh things to people, and then kind of reflect on how she doesn't want to do that, or kind of her relationship with Hedda as well. There's times when they get into a lot of conflict, and she wants this warm relationship with her, but there's also all this kind of bristly stuff going on as well that I found kind of interesting. And also I found interesting her reflections on Flora the ghost, because, well, you learn a bit more about why Flora might be haunting her at the end of the book, which I won't reveal. But even though Flora in real life was this annoying white woman intruding on them all the time, she was also incredibly kind, never did anything overtly offensive to them, and would basically give them the shirt off their back. You know what I'm trying to say? And she also adopted this daughter. And so, like, she's constantly, like, waging her mind the fact that she shouldn't feel as negatively towards Flora as she does, and yet she can't help but to feel really annoyed by Flora in her presence. And at times she even refers to her as her most annoying customer, and then she'll refer to her as her favorite customer. So I found that bit quite interesting.
It's interesting. I think some of the bits that I'm interpreting as being due to bad characterization, you're interpreting as being intentional. So maybe that's where the kind of split is coming, which is interesting. I mean, who's to say? But yeah, I'm glad you liked it a bit more than I did. I think I would read another book by her.
I would too. I own The Night Watchman and The Roundhouse, and I want to read both of them now.
I'm just glad we read a book that generated a bit of conversation.
I know. I guess if we were to give it like a final star rating to kind of put a cap on things, where would you guys land?
I think I would probably give it a 3.
Yeah, I'm a 3.
4.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So we're closer than we think.
Yeah, I just didn't think it was terrible by any stretch of the imagination, and yeah, I just wish I don't know, could have been longer just to flesh some of those bits out.
One really interesting bit about the book is that at the end of the book, and maybe a reason if somebody's on the fence about reading the book, they might want to pick it up, is at the end of the book there is a gigantic recommended reading list.
Yes, it's online. I have the link to it,
yes.
so I can link to that in the show notes.
And there are quite a few books on here that I had not heard of about indigenous culture, history, etc. And there's also, besides that, there's like tons of novels and stuff like that. And yeah, I just think they all sound like I was looking up a whole bunch of them, and a lot of them sound really interesting, and I was like, I've never heard of some of these. So yeah, huge. It's definitely a book targeted to book lovers.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you're someone who likes books and recommendation, which I guess you are because you're listening to this right now, you probably would like it. I don't know why I didn't like that aspect of it. I guess I'm just bitter and
I'm the exact same way as you. Like, I am the type of person that should be targeted and like love this, but because I don't love that overly sentimental aspect of that kind of like precious feeling about books. You know what I mean? Like, people have this kind of like, I don't know, like, I just don't love that. You know what I mean? Like, not necessarily my thing.
Yeah.
But I know loads of people who are the type of people that, you know, follow the Women's Prize. You know, they're going to eat up all these book recommendations.
Love a list.
Yeah, exactly.
I love a list. That bit didn't bother me at all.
I should say, if at the end of the book it just had this gigantic recommended reading list, I wouldn't even mention the sentimental attitude about books. It's because of the conversations that people are having in the book where they're like, "Have you read all of it by Jeanette Hayne?" Like, where I'm just like, "Oh my god," you know what I mean? Like, that was the part of the book where I was like, "I get it, you guys like books." Like,
also, she was reading Proust. Of course, she was.
Oh yeah, she was, wasn't she?
But yeah, probably a good choice, I would say, for a discussion if you're looking for a book club book or something.
Yeah, book club book, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, shall we put a cap on it here then?
Please.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening to the podcast. If you would like to contact us with questions, ideas, feedback, recommendations, etc., feel free to email us at the bookcastclub@outlook.com. And we are on Twitter and Instagram at bookcastclub. And if you want, you can always leave us a voice message that we can play on the podcast. The link for that will be in the show notes. We also have a newsletter that you can sign up for if you're interested in hearing some more reviews from us, thoughts on new releases, podcast recommendations, and more updates on the podcast. And as always, you can support us financially over on Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you in the next episode.